day, but it's early podcast day because on Tuesdays we talk about common good faith, and we do it an hour earlier than the other times because it fits our schedules better. Normally, Stephany and I are joined by Laura Truax and Dominique Gilliard. Laura's away this week. Dominique's going to join us here in a little bit, but Stephany, good to see you. As I like to say every week to the people here on the listen on the Wednesday podcast, and every day to people listening on the daily podcast, I'm sitting in Minneapolis. I say that regretfully again because I want to stand when I do these podcasts, and once again, I didn't do it. Tomorrow, I promise myself that I will stand up because, as I joked yesterday, they say that sitting is the new smoking. So it's time for me to kick the habit and stand up during the podcast. So if you're watching on the live stream, we'd love for you to let us know where you're listening from, what it is that you're doing. And if you're listening on the podcast, send us a note over at podcast@vocommongood.com so we know where you're coming from and what it is you're doing, and take a moment and sort of notice where you find yourself. Stephany, where are you right now? Where do you find yourself on this given day?
Good morning, everyone. I am in Colorado Springs, Colorado, and just like Doug shared, I am committed to breaking the habit and making sure I close my rings and stand throughout the day. So it's a good Wednesday morning, and we are talking about faith and all the things associated with it.
We decided that we're going to take on the topic of faith and women, common good, Christianity, church, and I'll tell you, Steph, it is shocking to me and maddening and frustrating that on the 10th of March, 2021, not only is it legitimate for us to have a conversation pushing back on people saying that women should not give leadership in Christianity in churches and in other places in society, but that it's actual news stories, that there are news stories that come out. My news feed the last 2 or 3 days have had multiple stories of men saying stuff full-throatedly that they truly believe in this day that women shouldn't lead. It is stunning to me. So I can't imagine how hard it is and frustrating for you who have lived this experience in so many ways with so much more consequence than I ever have.
I know. It's like they had a convention and got together and said, what could we do to top the pandemic in 2020? And so in 2021, let's, in the middle of Women's History Month, make the most idiotic statements ever. So just like you, my news feed is just full of things where women are, fighting back against this patriarchal structure. You had Beth Moore, who announced her departure from Lifeway. And for those who don't know, Beth Moore is a Southern Baptist Bible teacher, because she has never been able to take on the role of preacher, pastor, minister, because of the way that the Southern Baptist convention and organization, for those who might not, be full of church language, the way that the Southern Baptists organize themselves. And so here she is breaking away from an organization that she has given so many years, so much time to, has developed a tremendous following because she is a skilled teacher and preacher of the gospel. But again, they will not give her that title. And she had to endure, like millions of other Christian women, the way in which white evangelical men stood behind Donald Trump, did not denounce his sexual violence, did not denounce his idolatry, did not denounce his anti-Christ behavior.
Yeah.
And that for a lot of people that we are even seeing, men, women, and non-binary, are just really breaking away from denominations and Christianity, and by and large, because of the ways that white evangelicals just did not step up to the plate these last 4 years.
That is so well said. The article that we referred to, which is in Religion News Service, documents this story, right, of her leaving. And look, if this was just a one-off, if this was just a moment where, like, I don't know, every organization, institution, movement has its struggle, and if this was, here's picking at a scab on the wound that is the Southern Baptists, then maybe we would be right to hear Jesus teach us, take care of the plank in your own eye before you deal with the speck in your brother's eye, right? That's a good teaching. It's good to remember. We shouldn't run around and sort of nitpick at other movements or organizations or people who think differently, and they're sort of comparing their worst moment to our best moment, like that. None of that. But that's not what this is.
No.
Beth Moore having to announce, and really it painstakingly slow progress of announcing that she's going to no longer associate herself with the Southern Baptists because she can't, as she puts it in the article, she can't see herself there any longer. She can't see herself in that world, not only because of the fact that they don't allow women leadership, which clearly comes up. We'll even show a quote from that here in a minute, but because as a movement, as an effort, the response to the anti-woman narratives that she sees inside that movement that go back to, for her, the shocking moment was the campaign in 2016 when Donald Trump was recorded as having said the things that he said in the Access Hollywood tape, and all the other information that came out. And then the people didn't respond to it. And then she also talks about the sexual abuse narratives inside the Southern Baptists that weren't responded to. And so a series of issues, and then the white nationalism and the Christian nationalism and all of these things compounding together. Finally, and I don't know Beth Moore, so I can't speak on behalf of her, and I'm certainly not trying to, but from the article, she finally says, look, this has to change. But it's not just Beth Moore. And the other thing is, it's not only men who support this idea that men are over women in issues of authority in churches. Millions of women also feel this way. Like if this was so simple as there's a set of men inside of an institution that have a death grip on it, we should call that out. That does happen at times. But this whole broader movement, it's more than this. So I'm interested because other than the first week, we haven't always talked about all of your pedigree and what you do. Can you talk a little bit about what your expertise is, your academic expertise? Because you're not only a pastor at Ebenezer Baptist Church there in Colorado Springs, but you're also a professor. And when we first met, I was, of all the things I was struck by with you, the topic of your study, the fact that your area of study is an area of study, I think says a lot. So would you mind just talking a little bit about that?
Absolutely. So I am located in women's and ethnic studies. I actually have an American studies degree, but my specific research is on critical white masculinities in popular culture. And so thinking about the ways that white masculinity is constructed, is utilized, is a failure even unto white men, like the ideal of it, all of that plays out in so many different ways, not just in popular culture, but in religion, in politics, in so many areas of our life in Western society. And so you're absolutely right. It's not just men upholding these ideological practices, right? It's millions of women too who come to this normative narrative about what masculinity is, what femininity is, how it should play out. And so I've had to personally deal with that, both in my research as well as in my walk in my faith journey as a pastor. It was one of the first questions that I considered before I even went into ministry. And having grown up in a non-denominational space where my pastor is a woman, it never occurred to me until I left that space and went to undergrad that there was a problem with women in leadership. It was not in my framework, right? I literally grew up in a bubble because it was normal for me. That was what I knew from birth, that my pastor was a woman in the 80s. But when I went to the South, to Atlanta, Georgia, in the late 90s and early 2000s, and people began to like question, like, you have a woman as a, I was like so blown away. And then even myself coming into the American Baptist Association, there are other denominations that are Baptist that aren't as progressive as ABC, right? So you have Progressive Baptists, you have National Baptists. Most people know Southern Baptists, and then there are others, but they in a lot of ways are still wrestling with the gendered politics of leadership in congregation and in church space. And some of my friends were asking me to join associations, asking our church to affiliate. And I was like, there's no way on God's green earth that we are going to pay into an organization where you will not even recognize the pastor of their congregation. Like, what fool do you think I am? So it's so very much still real and present.
It sure is. How did you choose the area of white male masculinity as your focus inside of women's studies? Was there a moment? Was that a burgeoning area? I mean, it's a big deal. I'm not saying this was a long time ago that you did this, but now the issue of male masculinity has come to the public awareness in a way that has been understood in academic study in places where people study sort of the development of American culture and society. Was there something that caused you to say, look, white male masculinity and the fragility of white males in the United States is a particular thing of interest because it has such power or damaging ability to it?
It's actually funny story how I came to this place. And it was early on in the discipline, in the development of the academic field itself. So I got my PhD in 2007. And for some people, they're like, oh, that wasn't that long ago, but that's a lifetime in academia, especially when we get to this place where the language of white privilege and masculinities within us, masculinity studies, hegemonic masculinity, toxic masculinity are like common language for people using today. It was so uncommon at the time that I was doing this work. And the reality is I was actually going to do a dissertation project on the embodied realities of race and racism from a creative, poetic space, right? I was a spoken word artist in grad school. I was studying critical race theory, and I really wanted to examine what it meant in a poetic way to be a Black woman embodied in this place of race in the United States. And my dissertation committee, they were like, oh my God, that would be a phenomenal project. Like, because again, performance studies was also in a burgeoning place, right? And they were like, that would be so phenomenal if you were in Chicago or New York, but you are in Indiana, and that is not what we do here. So I was like, great. That was just, it was the hardest blow to me as an academic, as a creative, and so forth. And so it took 3 different dissertation proposals. So I got rejected that first time. I came back with another proposal, and it too was rejected because, again, I was still trying to be creative and do stuff that I was passionate about. And then one of my dissertation committee persons said, look, Stephany, this is an exercise. Do the exercise. So basically, he was like, write a paper that is a literary analysis. And I was like, oh, all right, I'll give you an exercise. If I can't study myself, then I'm gonna study white men because white men been studying us forever.
Wow.
And that's
Genius.
That's how I came to my dissertation topic. And it really like focused on Mark Twain and F. Scott Fitzgerald, but like, classic canonical white men, and how frustrated they themselves were with the identity of being white men, because they were never the ideal representation of white masculinity.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, it's so wise to look at it that way, because what we see in churches, I know that religious people root this in the use of biblical narratives. Of course they do.
Mm-hmm.
That's what religious people are good at doing, is using their text to justify their cultural moments. We all do it. We have to watch it, and when you notice that it's happening, you make adjustments for it, because it's not like, well, that's a problem that some people have. It's a condition that we all suffer from, that we use the Bible to justify our position. So that's the case. So yes, people use the Bible, there's Bible arguments and so on. You very quickly realize when you're in these conversations, whether it's the ones that people will be having about Beth Moore, or as you mentioned earlier, maybe it was before we came on live, about the pastor who said the horrible things about women needing to lose weight.
Who get fat, yes, in their marriages, who don't take care of themselves.
That it's their fault if their husbands, violate their commitments to their, sexual solidarity with their wife. All this kind of nonsense, right? Once you start down that road of that conversation, it very quickly turns into a conversation about masculinity. And this is where people get sideswiped. Like, they don't see that coming, right? They very often will think that the conversation is going to be about, I don't know, Bible passages or something about genders. And then there's this notion in this world that I don't fully understand called complementarianism, where each gender kind of has its function and its role. But all of that is to protect men from being diminished for not being manly enough. And this is also what roots so many people in anti-gay narratives, and certainly roots people in the anti-transgender narratives. It is a misunderstanding. I don't know if it's a misunderstanding. It's a insecurity.
Yes, it's the fragility of masculinity, right? It's like, how fragile is the construct and the concept of being a man, right? And to some extent, if you aren't studying it, it just might be mind-boggling, but you can see the level of insecurities just all over the place. And again, wanting to get back to, how biblical narratives are used. But since I do popular culture as well, this past weekend, we saw it with Piers Morgan, right? Who stormed off of his show because Meghan Markle and Harry, shared their experience of what she was living with under the British crown, right? So the idea that anybody is surprised that racism is happening in the royal family is ridiculous, right? Like, not the people who literally colonized 90% of the planet. We're not surprised that racism exists in this structure. But when you look back at his interviews and his discussions of Meghan, it shifts, because there's one episode or one interview where he's talking about how he attempted to date her, and they were out like for 10 hours in a pub, drinking and having a good time. He put her in a cab, and the cab took her to the party where she met Harry and became a princess. So all of this years later is really connected to the way she ghosted
the TMZ edition of the Piers Morgan and Meghan Markle. I had no idea.
Right, because she ghosted him and ended up dating somebody that made her a princess, It is it's so just like the fragility of masculinity on display.
Yeah, it is. And it there are not a lot of good tools, right? This is one of the places where I think that maybe religious communities and Christian churches are leading the way. So, and I know it doesn't sound that way to someone, and I would, if someone rolled their eyes right now, I wouldn't blame them. But let me suggest it this way. I live in Minnesota, and I hear very often from Black people who live in Minnesota that the racism here is different than it is in the South. that in the South, they feel like the history of racism has brought it to the surface and you know what you're dealing with. In the North, especially in the Midwest part of the North, it sits below the surface and people don't acknowledge that that's what's going on. Right. So there's some people who would suggest that there's an honesty, even though it feels more blatant in parts of the South because of the history of segregation and Jim Crow laws than it is in the United States and than it is in other parts of the United States. The fact that churches, so many of them, are blatant about their anti-woman leadership narratives, in my metaphor here, is more like the South. Now, oftentimes it's also in the South, so there's a correlation there. But in the rest of our culture, I think there's also a very strong apprehension, fear of, and bias against women leaders. Like, you just look across the system, and it's not just churches and religious communities. And it's not just conservatives that have less women leaders. Like, even in progressive denominations of Christianity, the number of women that actually lead congregations, teeny. When you look at boards, when you look at loans that are given out to people starting businesses, when you look at, in many sectors outside of a few, healthcare and education tend to be different than that, but all the other sectors, the idea that women can't do that, women can't lead, like the fact that we're championing, and Vote Common Good is actually championing a women's conference run by a bunch of women around the globe that are championing women's causes. The fact that we have to do that broadly in our society and our culture, it tells us that this is not just a religious problem. It might even be a global problem or a human problem, I don't know. But it feels like the religion that you and I hold to, Christianity, is supposed to be the counter to that. That's
absolutely. And there's so much biblical evidence to the fact that God is not beholden to these structures these hierarchical structures that we have put in place, right? Again, when I was going into ministry, people would question, well, there are no women leaders in the Bible. Where do you point to the women? And I'm like, do you not know the story of Deborah? Do you not like what Bible are you reading, right? And the way that even the faith narrative, the lineage of Christ is rooted in castaway women, right? We look at the story of Rahab, who was literally on the margins. She lived in the walls of the city. And ran a brothel, and begins the lineage that gives us David, that then gives us Christ, and how much that is connected to the God story, right? So it's baffling, but you're right. Like, the insidiousness to the point that it is the air that we breathe, and may not always be so blatant in our face. Like, things would happen, even in, ABC, where the acknowledgement of women as pastors is there, and, the affirmation of women as preachers is there. But the invitation to actually preach would only happen on, like, Women's Day or Mother's Day or something like that. And in some places, some congregations, they still would invite you to preach, but would not allow you to sit in the pulpit, right? Like, what? And having to navigate those decisions. Do I speak from the floor, or do I just say, like, I'm not here for any of this? Either you affirm me fully, or you can find somebody else who's willing to do that, because that is not who God has made me to be.
Well, and this is where this story of Beth Moore and this particular case is, it's broader in our culture and really in our society, because there's been a long culture development that has struggled with the role of women in society. It's it feels like it's it's perpetual, right? And I wonder if, like, I would bring up the idea that I get frustrated by this. It felt like in the 1980s there was a resurgence of this kind of, or in the 70s, this resurgence of anti-women leadership, and then in the 1980s it felt like there was sort of an agreement in society that we were moving, and even in churches. And then it came roaring back in the 90s, you know, with this whole male fragility kind of movement. Someone told me one time that there's a difference between a problem and a dilemma. And they said a problem is that you have a solution and you're just finding the solution to a problem. And we just have a lot of problems. We should solve those problems. Then they said, but then there's a dilemma. And a dilemma is not a problem. A dilemma is a predicament. And a predicament means that you have multiple responses, and multiple responses are needed, and it's ongoing, right? And I started to think about, like, so many issues in our society, if we deal with them as a problem as opposed to a predicament and a dilemma, we really use a different tool set. I think I have thought about, in churches, especially in Christianity and in culture, that anti-women narratives are a problem that we're going to solve. And I worry, I worry about describing it as a perpetual dilemma that we're going to continue to live with. That, I don't know, maybe there's something inside of a flawed glitch in our brain, or something in our biology or our chemistry that makes, you know, where you get dads fighting with their sons over the affection of the mother, and, you know, they go back into history, right? Like, I don't know. Is there something deeper here that's at a deep spiritual level that we have to approach in a way differently than like a societal problem that we can structure a solution for?
I think that when we approach it from an elevated and central Western narrative, then it is a problem that is, then it is a predicament that is perpetual, and something that we perceive as being based to the existence of humanity, because that is the way that Western ideology is constructed in these hierarchical notions of being. But there are other indigenous ways of thought that do not invest in the ideology of hierarchy, that demonstrates there is the possibility of balance. And if we approach problems outside of Western constructions, then we can see the way in which balance and equity is really uplifted in other spaces that have resisted as much as possible Western notions and ideas. And so, again, part of that is shifting our narrative and our worldview, how we engage each other, how we see humanity in order to do this work. So yeah, it's like, you know, it's reframing and retraining our minds to know that other experiences exist.
Do you feel hopeful about any of this? Like, it's sort of, you know, rooting you where you are, just sort of in age, and watching how things have developed over
I think
time.
I think I have to be hopeful. Otherwise, I would, unfortunately and honestly, be suicidal, right? If there were no hope to wake up every day and believe that difference is possible, that progress is possible, that we will get to this place, and that my faith is not in vain. If I didn't believe that, then it would weigh so heavy on my spirit and mental state of being that that what would be the point of this life, right?
Yeah,
So,
I hear you. Yeah. No, yes, that's why I'm so appreciative of your friendship and role in my life. On the other hand, I think, well, sometimes there are things that, like, when I talk about, like, I'm hopeful, I mean, I'm building up resistance, or I'm building up coping mechanisms, you know? So my wife and I were talking the other day, like, we're not all that old, but we're in our mid 50s, and we feel the power of aging coming on us, right? And all the things that means. And I'm like, okay, you know, the old joke, like, the only thing worse than getting old is the opposite of that, right? It's just stop getting old and you die early.
Yeah.
So when you feel yourself getting old, it feels like the question is, well, I need to develop coping mechanisms. I need to develop embracing mechanisms. I need to develop engaging mechanisms to deal with this reality that is not going to change. But I need to find a way to be alive and healthy, whole, and do human flourishing as I get older. But it's not going away. So I guess, and that's even rooted, and maybe that's like, I'm thinking about my own question to you. I guess I was asking the question, do you think that this issue with how we treat women in our society and in our world is more like aging, that we're just going to have to deal with it and we're going to have to find better ways to deal with it because it's going to keep coming up? There's going to continually be some version of the Southern Baptists or some version of Tiffany on the chat is saying the Latter-day Saints, the Mormon churches are about this. Every church has it, in some way. Lots of our society still struggles with women. That's just going to be there, and we're going to come up with better ways to deal with it. Or do you feel like, no, we're going to be able to set this aside and have it be a past reality that we can talk about as a past reality? And I don't know why I even want that, right? That's just all coping mechanism stuff, I guess. But
and my answer still remains the same, and I think it is in part because I'm not just a woman in this. I'm an African American woman in this, and for me, there is a deep spiritual, cosmological connection to the ministry of hope, right? That even the bleakest iteration of our humanity cannot be the extent of our humanity. If that were the case, where were the 400 years of those who, committed to survival? Where would that be for those who were enslaved in this place, right? So gender is no aberration of the right. Level of oppression that we are experiencing. And so I have to, even if it is so far off in the distance that it will be generations that I can't see, I have to believe, because I know that they did, right? I know that those who made conscious decisions, and again, not to disparage those who made different decisions, but made conscious decisions to survive the enslavement in the United States, right? Because they could have done similarly to others in their resistant moments. They could have jumped overboard. They could have committed infanticide, right? They could have done a number of different things that Africans who were enslaved in the transatlantic slave industry did, but somebody believed that at some point that their generations were not going to be enslaved. And so I hold on to those even though we're still dealing with racism, I hold on to that as I think about oppression in any form.
And this is United States National Women's Month, or Month of the Woman, right? This is marches.
It's Women's History Month. We just celebrated International Women's Day on Monday.
And the fact that that's a thing, right, is a reality, right? That we still benefit so greatly from putting a special focus and recognizing the role of women. And I remember, I don't think I was in high school or college or something. Lots of the days seemed either they were new in the world, or this kind of attribution of a day and a month, or I was just learning about them because I was in high school. But there was conversation well, how come there's not White Guy Day, White Male Day, right? And part of what goes on with Black History Month, part of what goes on with Women's History Month and Women's Day and so on, is to place a focus, because the default is to narrate the history through the lens of white males.
Yes.
Not only our past history, I'm not talking just about like the founding of the country and so on. I'm talking about like a week ago or 2 weeks ago, or how did this company come to be, or where did the church, like all the recent, very micro recent history and macro distant history is narrated through the lens of white males. And just for people who don't know, this is what some of us mean when we talk about a white normative narrative or white supremacy, is that the supreme narrative, the first narrative, the top narrative is white and it's male. And that's why there needs to be this focus. So that you had brought up that in this article that we had looked at, there's this particular quote, and I want to show it for people that are watching on the screen, but maybe I have to do it like this. There we go. So in this quote, you see there's somebody, you'll see the quote here. It's somebody named Al Mohler. And Albert Mohler is the president of the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary. And he is quoted having said on his podcast recently about issues like we're talking about today, quote, "There's just something about the order of creation that means that God intends for the preaching voice to be a male voice." That is a stunning statement, right?
Which is why I laugh.
Right. It is just profoundly shocking. It's one of these moments where you watch someone say the thing out loud. And for some reason, and I don't know if this is better or worse, but people who say stuff like Al Mohler is saying here, or like Donald Trump said for years, or like politicians are saying now, and other religious leaders are saying out loud, are things that people like they were accused of saying that, right? When we started the church that I was a part of for the last 20 years, we always started our gatherings with a woman's voice first. So something would always be said by a woman. And the reason for that, well, it was always music and then a woman, right? And the reason for this was that we said so many people have, and this was 20 years ago, which sounds like a long time, but of course in the history of this it's not, was people are so used to only hearing things in religious settings coming through a male voice. We could spend the next 20 years, we said when we first started doing this, and it wouldn't get anywhere near changing the tonal expectation that people have. Now, we're talking about this in like Protestant evangelical churches. It's also true in Catholic churches, and all of our Catholic brothers and sisters feel this very deeply, because in the Catholic Church, the role of priest cannot be filled by somebody who's a woman. So much male voice dominance. But to hear someone like Al Mohler, who's given lots of credence in our society and is the president of a large academic institution, say there's just something about created order that wants to have preaching be in a male voice. It is shockingly stunning. And I bring all this up, I'm sorry to go on so long, but because if we don't stay on this all the time, because I have wanted to over these last 20 years just to not talk about this, ignore these folks who are still saying these things, just kind of write them off as not serious and nothing to be concerned with. But in the last 4 or 5 years, all of my thoughts that like you just ignore folks like this, I've gotten more nervous about that. So this whole male voice thing, it seems like that's at the heart of what this is about, right? Is that fundamentally God is male
and only wants to hear from men. But I like what William has put in the comments, and want to just shout out and say thank you to everybody who is listening and watching on whichever platform that you are, whether you're Facebook, YouTube, Twitch. That's something that I don't even deal with, but we're grateful. But William has said, like, a lot of churches need to go back and look at Deborah in the Old Testament. There's proof that women can lead a church, not just lead a church. She led the nation, right? She was one of the judges. And when you look at that passage in the Bible, it doesn't talk about her husband at all, right? It wasn't like she was judged in relationship to her husband. We don't even know what her husband did, but she was chosen and elected by God to lead the nation. And even when the warrior that was instructed to do what she had called what the Lord had called them to do was fragile, and was like, I can't go unless you go with me. The prophecy was, well, you are going to be so embarrassed by the way that this plays out because of your insecurity and your fragility. And so again, God used the woman to give victory in that battle. And there are so many other, manifestations of God speaking directly to women, using women biblically. And so, yes, you wonder like, how do we get to this place? But it's so true. And the supremacy, just an example of that supremacy that Doug was mentioning just recently. So Stephen King, everybody has heard, or a lot of people have heard the name Stephen King. His wife is Tabitha King, right? They just gave a large donation to an organization that Tabitha is really connected to. And the headline in the newspaper was Stephen King and wife gives donation. So she writes back. She writes back to the news outlet and says, you could have identified me as mother of 3 children. You could have identified me as such and such. You could have identified me in this way. But the reality is you could have just used my name, right? You could have used my name and not my relationship to my husband, because this donation from my family was because of my interest in this organization. So again, that's the way that we normalize the presence of masculinity in our society.
Yes. You see this coming up so often when a woman is the leader in a system that's normally led by men, right? And we don't know how to language it, which is really the part of the problem, because I come from this linguistic background, and you hear Al Mohler using it here. Like, linguistics isn't only the words we use, it's the presentation of the words and the tone of the words and the voice of the words. So this idea that, well, some things are just kind of more male dominant, and leadership is often just diverted to the male. So in the example you gave, or you think about with Vice President Kamala Harris and how much kind of smirky giggle people give when they talk about the second gentleman, which is the spouse of the vice president, right? Or when many of us thought Hillary Clinton was going to win the election in 2016, there was all kinds of worry about Bill Clinton overall. Like, could a former president now, like all the kinds of things going on around Bill Clinton. But one of them was, and there was whole conversations about this, how do we refer to him? Right. It is, and with women, there's all this use of, is it Ms. or Mrs. or Miss? Like, where we don't know how to talk about women in our society.
Exactly.
We don't know. We're finally getting to the point, right, where we're like, when someone wins an award at the Academy Awards. I don't know my awards all that well. It's now just like they're all actors. One's not an actor and the other one an actress, right? We're trying to get there. Or on an airplane, it's flight attendants now, not a stewardess and a steward. Like, trying to find some shared language, but you just realize how deeply this runs and how much for so many people it's rooted in a tradition that told them that their families were safe. And I really think that a lot of this gets back into family narrative because we don't know how to talk about it. And I even felt this. I remember saying to my friend who was getting married, and he was marrying, Adam was marrying Travis. And I remember asking him, I said, like, how do you, I said, like, in your vows, how are you going to say it? This is the first one of the early gay marriages that I was talking with him sort of just as friends about. And I said, like, do you structure it the same way? Like, I take you to be my lawfully wedded husband. He said, yeah, that's how we're choosing to do it, because the spouse of a man is called a husband. But you just see the level of struggle that there is in knowing. So there's like partly the the conceptual way to talk about it and our own issues with our own masculinity or dads or moms or lots of stuff that goes on, or I don't know, maybe testosterone and other hormones. I don't know what drives all of this, but there's literally the word problems, right? Like we don't know. And this judge's comment that you brought up is so interesting because the very fact that Deborah in the Jewish scriptures is a judge tells you that there was a non-normative leadership role for women in that society and culture. And that was cheered on and told about for generations. So it just feels to me like, boy, we have so much work to do around truly how we talk about it, and that we have to talk about it because we have to get better at the lexicon. We have to get better at the narratives, and we have to get better at using all the sources of our society to address these issues.
Absolutely. I want to read Mike's comment in the chat, and then I want to ask Doug, while I'm reading it, to think about who's your favorite woman in the Bible. Mike said, let's not forget Mary Magdalene of the New Testament. She was a prominent figure in early Christianity. She was present at the tomb, the first person to whom Jesus appeared after his resurrection, and the first to preach the good news of that miracle. These are among the few specific assertions made about Mary Magdalene in the Gospels. And again, all of that is absolutely correct according to the scriptures that Mike points out. And want to thank you for those, again, who are watching, who are participating, engaging, and sharing comments, who will listen to the replay. But Doug, I'm curious. I want to know, who's your favorite woman in the Bible?
Well, there's I sort of have them in genre, right? So I became very intrigued my early days in Christianity as I got into it as a teenager and read the book of John and the book of Acts multiple times. And in the book of Acts, there's this couple called Priscilla and Aquila. And for whatever reason, like I could sort of tap into their story. So this is the early church, how these people are going to found a faith that takes the teachings and way of life of Jesus and extends it into contexts that are beyond just the initial followers of Jesus. So, and the Apostle Paul goes and studies and trains with Priscilla and Aquila. So the idea that there was this woman, Priscilla, now they're a couple, and that she is the one who has the most power in the narrative and in the story. So she was sort of first to me. And then it hits the Marys. And I was just in a conversation. I was on a podcast last week after we were done with this one. I think I mentioned to you I was going to go on to a highly conservative person's podcast. And the first question he said is, "Are you still a pastor?" And I said, "No, I stopped my role at the church at the church that I was at being a pastor. So I'm not doing that kind of work. I'm doing this other pastoring work like we're talking about now." And I said, so Nikki took over after me, and I did this on purpose. And then he says, "Is Nikki a man or a woman?" And I said, "Nikki's a woman." And then he said, "Well, women came from man. Don't you believe that?" And he's bringing up Genesis 3 from the rib sort of narrative, right? And we get into this whole nonsense about this. And I said, "Well, I understand that that story is told with that kind of language, but I'm also cognizant of the fact that Jesus came from Mary. Jesus is born of Mary." And you could literally see him stop. They went to a commercial break. He came back. He said, "Hey, I just want to bring up that even though Jesus came from Mary, he was fully born of the Father, and he's the son of the Father." Like, could not reconcile and hadn't thought about the idea that the Gospels present that the Son of Man, the Son of God, is born of Mary. And you actually, to your point earlier, hear very little about Joseph in the stories.
Correct.
It's and one of the both Luke and Matthew have a trajectory, and Luke tells the story or have a history, a family history. What's that called? A family history when they have a
genealogy.
A genealogy, and one of the genealogies follows the women, and one of the genealogies follows the men, and they all go back to the Adam and Eve narratives. So the idea that the Jesus that we follow, the Gospels want you not to miss the idea that he's born of Mary, and that the Catholic Church refers to her as the Mother Mary, mother of the church, mother of the faith,
Yes.
but even more so the mother of Jesus. And I think we're all supposed to sort of be reminded. And this is that like if you're going to do a derivative narrative, you don't do Eve came from Adam's rib, or do what St. Augustine did, which was to say that every human being in their mother's womb starts as a male, and then if there's some kind of a failure, they become women. Biologically, we actually know it's just the opposite, right?
Exactly.
That male gender develops because something changes from the norm. That everyone starts out as feminine, and then the genes kick in a male.
Oh my God,
gender.
are you talking science and faith now?
Science and faith, and it's not even Friday where we talk about science and faith. So anyway, this like born of, right? Like born of God and born of a woman, and everyone is. And I actually think, I brought it before, I think that the human being's ability to self-harm sits at the root of so much of our societal struggle and spiritual struggles. Like we're the only animals that self-harm, and trying to get our understanding around why it is that we self-harm. The anti-woman narrative roots back in some ways to this broken relationship that people have with their parents, their moms, and really with themselves, and this feeling of not being, of men, especially in our society, somehow not wanting to be something less than a man and somehow the woman, and it makes no sense. So I think that, Priscilla in the structural narrative of the Gospels, Mary, and then the line of Marys that are in the Gospels, it's almost like the name Mary becomes this standard for women as a whole. There's just Marys all over. So that's mine. Do you have favorite women biblical characters?
I have a number of them, but the Syrophoenician woman is one of my favorites. And again, as a women's and ethnic studies scholar, the idea that she's not even named, like that intrigues me, that she's described in her relationship to place and her outsideness, right? Like I'm drawn to a number of the women who are just like living on the margins. But for me, she's one of my favorite because she checks Jesus in such a way that Jesus is baffled, and he's like, all right, I gotta give you what you asked for.
Yeah, so
right?
so tell that story. Some people know the phrase Syrophoenician woman, but it's it's not a parable, which is really interesting about it. It's one of the narratives. So for people that know the difference in biblical gospel literature between Jesus telling a story in a parable and a narrative that involves Jesus. This is a narrative that involves Jesus, which I think is really, really powerful because Jesus becomes the learner in the story.
Exactly. So you have this woman, and Syrophoenician in a lot of ways just was, again, another symbol of being a Canaanite, which meant that this woman was not a Jew, right? And so Jesus comes to town with the disciples, and this woman is following after them, begging, pleading, making a lot of noise, like, you have to heal my daughter. My daughter is suffering from a condition, and I need your healing. And I'm not going anywhere until you heal my daughter. And so the disciples start to complain, and they're like, look, get rid of this woman. Would you? Like, she's drawing so much attention. She's loud. She's not, supposed to be with us. But there's also cultural norms at this time, right? Like men in space with women without a male guardian or whatever was problematic. The fact that she was a Canaanite and not Hebrew or Jewish was problematic. All of these different things. And so the disciples are just like, would you get rid of her? And so Jesus turns to the disciples and like, what would you have me to do? I came here to do work amongst the Jews, right? Like I came to do work amongst the household of faith. And so the woman is like, look, I'm not going anywhere until you bless my daughter. And so Jesus finally responds to her and says, you don't give the food off the table to the dogs. And he in the scripture, in the text, uses this language, this dehumanizing language of calling non-Jews in the moment dogs, right? And the woman turns to him and says, and this is, like my checkpoint moment, and says, yes, but even the dogs get the scraps from the master's table. And so Jesus is so stunned by her faith and her belief in him that he's just like, well, there you go. Your faith has made her whole, in the way that, Jesus typically does. And so it is her level of commitment that she doesn't care how she's being described. She doesn't care. She's not even there advocating for herself, right? Like, some people are committed to the advocacy when it's really about them, but she's like, my daughter needs this. I'm not going away. I don't care how you talk about me. You will bless her. and so Jesus is stunned by her faithfulness and her persistence. And so that is why she is, again, one of my favorite characters, because she just embodies so much of what I feel like often, and I'm trying not to cry. I will not cry. We got 4 minutes left. But what I feel like as a Black woman in this country, demanding the justice that is due Black people in this country, right? She embodies so much of that, and she demands it spiritually, and she doesn't care what anybody else is saying about her. So yeah, that's
I guess if there was a hashtag of the day, it would have been, and yet she persisted, right? It's that story.
She persisted.
and the fact that that's included, and that's in the gospel narratives, is one of all of the stories that we talk about, especially from the Gospels. The Gospels were a curated set of teachings, right? They weren't meant to be just a catch-all of everything. They weren't the update on the daily news. These were stories told for a reason, to perpetuate a particular version of what life could look like for humanity. I think that's what the Gospels are. They self-describe that way. So when these stories are included, when the multiple Gospels include the story of this woman saying, yeah, but Jesus, I want to teach you something, even the dog, that's there on purpose, right? That's not there sort of by accident. That's not a drive-by story. That's the focus of the teachings of the gospel. So this is why it feels like to stay on these issues and to keep raising them, whether it's our cultural moment to recognize the month of March or the International Women's Day, it's incumbent upon us, because there's a bunch of other folks working this same line, right? There's people out there telling you every day how women are supposed to be and how men are supposed to be, and playing into these narratives and being called forward into some kind of a human flourishing spirituality of common good and goodness, means there's a lot of issues that we have to address. And as we've mentioned so many times in this podcast, the issues are linked to each other. And actually the way you learn how to deal with one issue can actually help you and inform you to know how to deal with others. It's like people who tell me that learning a language, and I'm not great at languages, but once you know how to learn, once you know 2 languages, it makes a third language easier to get, because you start to know how to think in different languages. Dealing with some of these issues, wherever your starting point, whether it's race or it's economics or it's gender or it's church structures and power, there's so many issues that face all of us. But what they will do is start to develop in a person a way of being. And I think this is what Jesus teaches. This is why I'm such a fan of the Jesus narratives, is that Jesus wants there to be a different way of life for us to get at these kinds of issues. And they're going to keep coming. I am convinced by you to be hopeful that someday it's going to change. I just look at my own ticker and time frame that I have left and the number of breaths. I'm like, just kind of looking at how far we've come so far. I think I'm going to be living with this one perpetually. But maybe the generation that follows, the little ones that are being born today, maybe they will, maybe they can start from having more people like you in their life, which I think would be really fantastic and powerful and important. And look, anytime somebody wants to take one of these issues and compare it or contrast it or compete it against the others, push back on that, right? It's one of the things that happens in social movements, that they get competitive, and it would be better if they weren't.
All right.
Hey, on that note, a little programming note, Stephany and I are going to be co-hosting a 4-week training for churches, communities, leaders, individuals, on how to respond to Christian nationalism in our country and extremism that has taken root. So if you were shocked and scared by what happened on January 6th at the insurrection, so were a lot of us. And we've realized that we have to deal with this. So in April, on Tuesday nights in April, we're going to be hosting an online training with a bunch of experts in the fields around this. So if you're already in our stream, you'll be getting information about that. If you're not over at votecommongood.com and on our email list, that's the best place to get it because that's where the links come most clean. So head over there if you would. And subscribe to our podcast. If you're already a podcast listener, thank you. Maybe check us out on the live stream sometime. And if you're only on the live stream, know that we do have a podcast. And if you could subscribe, it really helps all those kinds of things. Steph, thanks so much. And I'm glad, I was thinking, boy, we're down 2 of our normal people today. But this was really delightful. I'm so glad we got to be just the 2 of us for today.
And so many great guests in the comments and everything. So thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Right on. Hey, thank you all. And we'll talk to you tomorrow and again next week. Bye-bye.